Hey, SEC Country, my name's Brandon Adams. Have not been on these pages in a little while, but we thought today might be an appropriate time to do that, to react to some very big news around the SEC that certainly impacts one program significantly and potentially impacts a few more there as well. You maybe have been following the story of former five-star tight end Arik Gilbert, one of the highest rated tight ends as a recruit in the country's history, who had originally signed with LSU as part of the 2020 class and really had, when he was playing, a productive first year for LSU. But one of the big stories of the offseason was Gilbert's decision to leave LSU, transfer, go into Florida. Obviously, many people thought following the footsteps of both Kyle Pitts, who had a great season last year for Florida as one of the most prolific tight ends in recent college football history, but also following the footsteps of Dan Mullen, who had made big use of the transfer portal with other former five-star recruits in recent seasons. So a lot of this kind of stuff in terms of Gilbert going to Florida seemed to make some sense. Well, apparently it made sense to everybody but Gilbert, who today on Twitter, just really an hour or so ago, has let it be known that he's decommitting from Florida. He will not be enrolling at the University of Florida. And Gilbert, through the power of Twitter, has let it be known that his recruitment is still open for right now. This is a massive college football story, one in which social media has really been buzzing about, message boards really clamoring for more information on. So we'll try to do our part here over the course of the next couple of minutes for those around the SEC to tell you what we know about this and kind of what we think might be able to happen next. First of all, on the Florida side of this, Gilbert was clearly considered a big focal point potentially for the offense for the 21 season. Tim Brewster, the Florida tight ends coach, had kind of bragged about this being a destination for tight ends. It was kind of a cryptic tweet from him going back to January, kind of foreshadowing the ultimate decision that Arik Gilbert made. And so now with Florida missing out on Gilbert, you're kind of forced to kind of re-rack your opinion on Florida in the post-Kyle Trask world, in the post-Kyle Pitts world. You know, Florida breaking in a new quarterback. Many people think it could be Emory Jones, possibility maybe Anthony Richardson competing for some playing time there in that spot there as well, but also having to lean on a new crop of playmakers. DeMarcus Bowman, the former Clemson running back, will obviously be a big part of that discussion. But if Gilbert could have gotten immediate eligibility, being granted that immediate eligibility, a lot of people had reason to believe that he would have been a huge part of the offense here this season. Not just because from a body type standpoint, maybe he reminds you of Pitts, but just because, you know, this was a guy who had, you know, big time recruiting credentials. And as we said before, Florida really needed, someone to kind of step into that role, because this is clearly a team that loses a lot offensively from what it utilized last year in what was kind of a breakout season for Dan Mullen, winning the SEC East for the very first time. Of course, a lot of this was going to be speculative anyway. As I said before, there was a need for Gilbert to be granted immediate eligibility. There is certainly the chance that the one-time transfer rule takes shape around college football, but even if that's the case, you're still going to need that sort of special waiver from the SEC. You may remember that's what a number of guys dealt with this past season. A couple guys leaving Georgia, for instance. Otis Reese going from Georgia to Ole Miss had to wait a long time to be granted his eligibility. Maybe a more high-profile case of that was Cade Mays. Georgia go back to Tennessee. Mays was eventually granted that. It was actually granted his before Reese got his, and was, that was done in time for him to be a starter fairly early in the season. But Joey Gatewood, for instance, leaving Auburn to go to Kentucky, he wasn't ruled eligible in time to play his old school there in week one. So you had some transfers leaving within the conference this past year, and the league office says because of the unusual circumstances surrounding coronavirus, that in a one-time situation, guys like Gatewood and Mays and Otis Reese and a few others would be given a chance to play right away without having to sit out that 1 year the way the SEC would typically call for, with an intra-conference transfer. As it stands right now, we don't know what the future of that is. The SEC told us a year ago this was a one-time deal, but honestly, like kind of a weak parent, once you say, I'm going to make this exception just this one time, typically sometimes there's a little bit of a backtrack on that after the fact. Maybe we see that. Maybe Florida could have negotiated on Gilbert's behalf and got him eligible right away, but that's not a given. So keep this in mind. This is where you kind of bring in some of the rest of the SEC on this. If Gilbert has obviously kind of moved on from Florida, the idea that some of the other potential SEC suitors that are out there for him, you'd have potentially the same issue. For instance, you think about Alabama, which has also been kind of an attractive, prolific offense. When Gilbert has made his two previous college decisions, leaning on offenses that had just performed really well was a big part of the choice that he made. Had Alabama been a factor in this, it's the same issue related to the need to be granted eligibility and kind of everything that goes along with that, to say nothing of a school like Georgia, which is really the home state school for Gilbert in this situation, or a school like Tennessee, which at one point in time had been thought to be kind of a factor in his recruitment. By the way, speaking of Tennessee, it is interesting to see within the last half hour or so, Harrison Bailey, the Tennessee quarterback, who was also a high school teammate of Gilbert's going back to their time at Marietta High School, which is in kind of the north suburbs of Atlanta, for those of you outside the state of Georgia. Harrison Bailey has kind of made his pitch for Gilbert to come be with him there at Tennessee and play with him there with the Vols. Of course, it's kind of ironic that Bailey's doing that, given the fact that Bailey at one point in time had said that he only chose Tennessee for Jeremy Pruitt. He put this on social media not too long ago himself, back before Pruitt had been fired. So you're going to start seeing some of this kind of stuff kind of coming out there of folks making their pitch for Gilbert, fans certainly making their pitch for Gilbert. Obviously, a lot of Georgia fans would love the idea of seeing, Georgia get back involved on this, given the fact that Georgia does have a 5-star tight end on the roster right now, Darnell Washington, who really played better. It was probably more of a focal point of the offense as the season went along for UGA here this year. And some people even speculated that maybe Georgia was showcasing Darnell Washington as a way of getting Arik Gilbert's attention. For instance, Kirby Smart, the Georgia coach, had some very interesting things to say after the Missouri game, which was the regular season finale. They ended up being the regular season finale for UGA, about how you can never have enough tight ends in the SEC. This after Washington had just had a very big game. A lot of folks kind of took that as maybe a wink and a nod in the direction of Arik Gilbert. This is not the only cryptic statement, by the way, that Smart has made that could potentially have some relevance in this discussion. There was an interview that Smart did on the National Signing Day. Georgia didn't sign anybody for the February signing day, but on that National Signing Day, Smart went on a Atlanta radio station called 680 The Fan there on that Wednesday night and was talking about how there was some outside the box opportunities still for Georgia. In the midst of that discussion, I don't have the full quote in front of me, I'm just going to paraphrase here. Smart was saying something to the effect of, people don't realize there are guys in the portal, they don't actually become, official until they enroll in classes. Until classes start, they're not technically signed. Smart was saying, basically referencing some of the technicalities related to the transfer portal situation. Was that intended to be a message that Georgia was continuing its recruitment of Arik Gilbert? Obviously, Smart keeps his cards close to the vest. This is obviously, though, something that a lot of fans on the Georgia side of this and the other SEC schools that are potentially competitors for his services, they may be wondering about too. I guess there's a possibility here that you bring LSU back into the fold, a school that I think had tried to keep him when Gilbert originally, what Ed Orgeron, the LSU coach, tried to describe as an opt-out, and then ended up being a trip to the transfer portal. It seemed like there may have been some attempt for LSU to try to keep Arik Gilbert right there, so maybe the door remains open for that. I have talked to folks close to Gilbert before, including Terrence Edwards, who was a former wide receiver and a personal coach for Gilbert at the time he was in high school. In terms of the possibility of maybe Gilbert ending up back at LSU, going back a month or so ago, a little more than that. It seemed like all doors were open at the time. Difficult to know how all of that has changed here over the course of the last little bit. The other part of this too, and listen, I don't have anything official to report on this, but it is certainly out there, and it's certainly a part of this discussion. If you look at some of the Florida media right now, folks on social media that kind of have Florida followings, 24/7 sports reporters who cover the University of Florida, one of the things that you do see come up is the idea that whatever happened with Rick Gilbert here was related to academics, that academically somehow it was prevented Gilbert leaving LSU, which is what he wanted to do, and coming to Florida right now. There are at least plenty of whispers coming out of Gainesville, and some of this from not just random Florida guy on Twitter, but actually people who kind of cover this team and are around that team, that there is an academic connection to this. Although, to be fair to Gilbert, the people who are suggesting that haven't gotten very specific with that. It's just something that you've kind of seen either show up on the message board that you might frequent or the social media, that you're the most acquainted with. There are some Florida reporters mentioning academics here as a factor in terms of why Gilbert did not end up at the University of Florida, making the announcement he made a moment ago. I'm going to take some of your comments here in just a moment here on the SEC Country, both Facebook and the SEC Country Live YouTube page. And for folks who are tuning in on both those, appreciate you being here. It's kind of fun to actually be back doing this again. Been a while since we have done this. So we'll dive in and do some of your comments here in just a moment. But if you're just joining us, Arik Gilbert leaving LSU, supposed to be transferring to Florida, but a moment ago announcing that he is actually not transferring to Florida. He's opening his recruitment back up. This is as he described, a commitment from his transfer portal destination to Florida. Florida fans left to figure out what this means for their offense in the field in 2021. A number of other SEC schools, certainly Georgia, Alabama, maybe Tennessee, maybe possibly even LSU, kind of wondering how any of this kind of factors back in for them, and where might be the new destination for Rick Gilbert, if indeed there is a destination this upcoming year. Of course, with the SEC's own prohibition on intra-conference transfers, at least in terms of immediate eligibility, kind of factoring all of this too. You following all of that? Hopefully you are. Let's take some of your comments here right now. Let's see what's going on. Avery Sworn says, can you talk about how our offensive line is progressing? I don't know if that's in relationship to Florida here or what. Blake Robinson says, I feel the same way about our tight ends as an Auburn fan. I could care less where he goes. I just find humor in Florida. I think there's definitely some of this out there today, Blake, whereas I think there is a little bit of, listen, y'all know this, no matter what SEC school you cheer for, there's a little bit of folks love the idea of mocking the other school who gets bad news. And unfortunately for Florida fans today, they are definitely having to take this on the chin a little bit. And some of this is related to the fact that Tim Brewster was a lot of big talk about, what Florida was doing and how it was the destination for tight ends. And, certainly there's been a lot of bragging about, Dan Mullen utilizing Gilbert much the same way Pitts was utilized a year ago. It's also a Florida team that had a little bit of a controversial run through the end of the season, embarrassing performance in the bowl game, the thrown shoe in the loss to LSU, and kind of everything that kind of goes along with that. So definitely, whether you're an Auburn fan or an Alabama fan or an LSU fan or whatever else, Georgia fans, certainly, there's a lot of fun being had at the expense of Florida here today. Avery Sworn says y'all blow up all these players' heads, and that's why they have entitlement issues. So in the case of Gilbert, I'm actually not that convinced that what's going on with Rick Gilbert is an entitlement issue. And I'm not that necessarily aware of anything that's going on with his situation that would require me to necessarily want to criticize him for anything that he's done here. Now, listen, you got the whispers of the academic stuff, and I told you that before. That's real enough that that's at least worth me mentioning to you right now. But it's fair to note that there's also this thing of, oh, this young man's got a lot of going on right now. Look, to the people who are kind of, on social media saying that, either report it or don't. Like, if you've got something specific and tangible to report about Gilbert, then say it. But if you're just trying to put a whisper campaign, when this comes from kind of what you might view as pro-Florida media, if you're putting this out there on a day in which Gilbert has decommitted from Florida, it has the whiff of like a propaganda campaign to make Florida look better for not getting a Rick Gilbert. If you've got something specific to report about Gilbert for, what might have led to this decision, then by all means do so. But hey, I know something you don't know game here, I don't think that sits very well with most SEC fans. So, I get where you're coming from. When a guy bounces from one school to the other and then decides he doesn't want to go to that school, I think that some people have a tendency to look at that as, oh, these are just these recruits or young football players, with the big head, with the sense of entitlement. But there is a chance this is just a young man who's trying to be deliberate and make sure he makes the best choice for himself. Left his home state of Georgia, go all the way out to Louisiana as a part of the class of 2020. It seems like he may have regret that decision. I think a lot of us have decisions we made when we were 18 that we later on regretted. And so to make sure that you don't do that now, especially with a lot of voices in your ear telling you one thing or the other, to make sure you don't make that mistake, I actually don't think that necessarily reflects some sort of sense of entitlement for Gilbert. Now, I said before, you're going to hear lots of things related to academics and things like that online. Some of that's at least real enough that people are willing to put their name next to it. But in terms of, specific reporting on that, there's certainly a lot more rumor than there is actual tangible facts related to some of that. Ronnie Vernon Harris says, he's obviously an elite talent. Georgia may not need him, but we shouldn't want him to go somewhere that can also impact us. And Ronnie, I think you're exactly right about this, that when whether it's Georgia or any other school around the SEC, when you get a player, for instance, when Florida thought it was getting Gilbert, not only is it good for Florida to have that guy, it's good to prevent somebody else from being able to get him there as well. That's a big part of this, as you want that big transfer player, in part because you don't want him playing against you. And, listen, in the case of Gilbert, I'll be very candid here for a moment. I'm not a scout. I don't think you should treat me like one, but I do watch both college and high school football pretty closely. And I can tell you, I'm as enamored with Gilbert as a prospect as I really have been with almost anybody over the last couple of recruiting cycles. I think this is a very, very special talent that I think from a athletic standpoint, I think he compares more to some of this league's best wide receivers, not like Devontae Smith. I'm not making that comparison necessarily, but in terms of an athletic big wide receiver, more so than he necessarily does just the tight ends that you've seen. That's the kind of player that I think that he can be. And that's true for me no matter where he ends up, assuming that he does end up playing somewhere this fall. And by the way, I think it's probably also fair to mention, because you do have the SEC pending rule with the intra-conference transfer, that there could be a little more attraction related to, well, maybe he goes somewhere outside the SEC for his next school. People will remember that Clemson was a factor in recruitment when he announced as part of the class of 2020. It would be unusual for Clemson to reemerge in that discussion right now, because under Dabo Swinney, Clemson has typically not been a player in the transfer market. So kind of keep that in mind a little bit for right now. Jeff Weeks, apparently a Florida fan, says don't need him, we'll be just fine. Jeff, I'm not sure how many Florida fans necessarily agree with that, but interesting to see you weighing in on that. Michael Hall says, where do you believe he could land? As I mentioned before, obviously you got the sort of handful of suspects you think about in the SEC. Georgia's the home state school. Tennessee's been a factor in his recruitment before. Alabama just seems to be a factor for everybody. At some point in time, you wonder, how do they still even have any available scholarships? But they're clearly a factor in all these kind of recruitments. But the possibility, because you do have the intra-conference transfer rule, that maybe a school outside the SEC also shows up here too. But if it is a non-SEC school, I don't expect it to be Clemson, the school that was probably the biggest non-SEC school in his recruitment the first time around. Penn Jones says, I think he either goes back to LSU or another school outside the SEC, so he wouldn't have to sit out. I think you may be right about that. Plus, sometimes I wonder, listen, I'm not an expert when it comes to academic stuff, but if the reports coming out of Gainesville are true, and Florida's issue with Gilbert was related to academics somehow, you almost wonder, is it easier to get eligible at the school where you're currently enrolled as opposed to trying to transfer into a new school? I think that's sometimes something you might wonder about. The other thing for Florida, which I find kind of interesting, is, Florida also made it be known on the February signing day that Florida did not send a letter of intent for Terrion Arnold to sign. Arnold, the defensive back from like the Tallahassee area, who eventually chose Alabama. And it was kind of spun as Florida just doesn't have room for Arnold right now. They want to focus on transfer portal guys. The assumption was that it was Arik Gilbert who kind of got the scholarship that Terrion Arnold could have used. You almost wonder now, does Florida want a second chance, or wish it had a second chance on Terrion Arnold, the kind of defensive back that Florida typically seems to covet, who went to Alabama, chose Alabama over Georgia. That will do. Florida not a factor there at the end of the Arnold recruitment, because as the Gainesville Sun and some other media outlets reported, Florida did not send Arnold a letter of intent. So kind of wonder about that. A few more Facebook comments, and we'll hop over to the YouTube side of things here for a moment. By the way, it's fun to be on the SEC Country page here this afternoon. Wes James says, we welcome all the Gator haters in here. Yeah, listen, there's a lot of Gator hating going on in this SEC Country Facebook page. And listen, Florida fans, don't take that too personal. SEC fans, it's already been a long off season. That's the thing you got to understand is there's not really been that much real news, just to be candid here for a moment. So when you finally have big news, even if it's bad news for Florida, there are a number of SEC fans who are going to want to just hop in here just for a second, just in, kind of relationship to that. Let's do a few more here. Steve Weaver taking a shot at UGA in here. Randall Scott Peterson also mentioned the possibility of Oklahoma, saying, I hope it doesn't end up at Oklahoma. He doesn't end up at Oklahoma. They're loaded, and this could be the final piece of a great roster. Brian Wright says, is SEC Country back? We're happy to be here today, Brian. That's what I can tell you. We're happy to be here today. Gary Pittman says Florida depending on locking that recruit down. I mean, listen, there was certainly I mean, I know we heard some Florida fans earlier that said we don't really feel like we need Arik Gilbert, but I'm not quite so sure most Florida fans necessarily feel that way. That I think they kind of, I do think they kind of view this as a little bit of a loss. I do, to be honest with you. That uh, I think they do kind of view that as a little bit of a loss because Gilbert, had he been eligible, could have been a real playmaker. So I'm either on the wrong YouTube page or something here. Here we go. Let's check out this YouTube page here. Niasor L on the YouTube sort of thing says, "Come on home to Georgia, go Dogs." So yeah, there's definitely a Georgia contingent here that views this as potential good news for UGA, and some of the things that Smart has said in the past. And I referenced some of these things before, which leads you to believe that's maybe a possibility. But there's still a long way to go on this. For one thing, Kirby Smart, even with the possibility of leading into the Arik Gilbert situation, he has not really changed his public stance on intra-conference transfers, things like that. He's been pretty careful about how he's chosen his words on this. So, certainly Smart seemed to fight against the intra-conference transfer thing, or at least that was the perception you got related to what happened with the Cade May situation and the other players that left, Georgia around that time. But even since then, Smart has not really given a hypocritical statement related to that. So by welcoming in Gilbert now, it would require some sort of public alteration of Smart's stance related to the intra-conference transfers as it is. Jermaine Dunbar checking on YouTube to say, BA, and that's what people call me, I want you to know how big it was, that smile, when you heard about Florida losing a 5-star tight end. Yeah, so myself, a lot of the Georgia fans certainly having a good time with that here for right now. Let's get a few more of your comments here on Facebook there as well. Brian Knuckles not too happy here. Look, good to see our buddy Cliff Nelson checking in. Boy, I hadn't seen Cliff Nelson in a minute, but good to see him on here as well. Cliff, a great commenter in the days past around SEC country. I know he's a big LSU fan. I know he's very curious to see things how things go related to Arik Gilbert. Esteban Esteves, another one of our really good commenters. Always a lot of fun there. But to Brian Knuckles' point, related to Rick Gilbert and what you typically kind of think of as kind of a homecoming for guys. They leave one school, they kind of transfer back coming to home. And kind of the old days, and by old days I mean like 4 years ago, that was kind of how you got that eligibility. You kind of pleaded a hardship, you came closer to home. In the case of Gainesville, Florida, though, it's obviously not much closer to his Marietta, Georgia hometown than Baton Rouge, Louisiana would be. But it's nice to see a lot of our familiar faces showing up here on the SEC Country page. Gary Patman over here having some fun too. Yes, a lot of comments rolling in here. So let me see if I can kind of reset a lot of this. So former 5-star tight end, pretty big contributor for LSU as a freshman in the early going of the season. Eventually, word was getting homesick. Ed Orgeron, the LSU coach, called that an opt-out. It eventually turned into what most people kind of thought it would be, which is a trip to the transfer portal. A lot of folks kind of re-racked some of his initial recruiting, interest of schools like Georgia, Alabama, Clemson, even though Clemson doesn't typically take transfers. There had also been some thought about Florida. At one point in time, there was a Rivals.com report that Gilbert was a done deal to Florida. Later on, that's indeed what happened. Gilbert did commit to Florida in January. Many of you remember that. But about an hour and a half ago or so, Gilbert has announced that he's decommitting from that transfer decision to Florida. He's reopening his recruitment, and we're left to kind of figure out, kind of where all of this goes. Harrison Bailey, his former high school quarterback at Marietta, has been on Twitter within the last hour, encouraging him to come to Tennessee. A lot of Georgia fans encouraging him to come to UGA. A lot of other fans kind of just sort of carry on in this. As we said before, there is a chance that for Gilbert, the best move may be outside the SEC on this, given the fact that the SEC's transfer rule is, at least the way that it's written and the way that it has been enforced up until 2020, is prohibitive when it comes to these kind of intra-conference transfers. So we're covering all of that right now. And we're going to take a couple more of your comments. Bob Warren checking in here there as well with his predictions about where he thinks he goes. He mentions Louisville as a possibility here, or Florida State, or Miami. Miami's obviously a school that's certainly increased its recruiting profile as of late, and has had great success with tight ends before. So it'll be interesting to watch. Robert Barnes says he doesn't think that Kirby will bite on Arik Gilbert. Yeah, Robert, I was saying this before, and maybe you're part of the video, maybe you weren't at the time, that some of the things that Smart has said would lead you to believe, oh, well, this is actually maybe a perfect fit. What he said after the Missouri game about never having enough quality tight ends. A lot of people took that as a cryptic statement in relationship to Gilbert. There was the statement from the beginning of February on National Signing Day when he talked about outside the box thinking, and he mentioned transfer portal guys and how you're not really, on a roster until you enroll in classes there at that school. That maybe that was an example that Georgia was still recruiting a Rick Gilbert, but some of the stuff that Smart has said related to intra-conference transfers would lead you to believe that he's not necessarily waving the flag for that rule to become a permanent change the way that it was temporarily changed for 2020. So Smart's statements have been either very cryptic, potentially contradictory. My guess is there has been a recruitment of Gilbert by Georgia, but will ultimately Georgia be looking to pull the trigger? And can anybody pull the trigger on a Rick Gilbert if some of the stuff that Florida's 24/7 sports page and other Florida media voices on Twitter have suggested, which is that somehow Gilbert's decision not to be at Florida is related to some academic issues. So there's a lot there on that. Don Harris says he's Alabama bound. I think there are a lot of non-Alabama fans in the comment section right now who are saying, how does Alabama still have more scholarships? It feels like they've signed 300 players in the last, 4 recruiting cycles. Gary Patman, also mentioning Georgia, Oklahoma, and Alabama, which are, you certainly understand why anybody would mention those schools as a possibility. The one thing about Gilbert is that he's not really said very much about this. And that's another thing that I would say to those who kind of say, this is just attention-seeking behavior from Gilbert. The truth is, people like me who kind of shot into a streaming video for a living have been very curious about Gilbert. We've been trying to get him to give us some information leading up to his decision to choose Florida not too long ago. The honest truth is that Gilbert hasn't been incredibly public about a lot of this kind of stuff. So ultimately what his thought process is right now, we may not hear much from Gilbert on that. I mentioned some folks that I know who are, close to Gilbert, who've even had meals with Gilbert within the last couple of months. Even in those private conversations with those folks, Rick just hasn't said a lot necessarily about the way that he's thinking about all of this. So I would caution anybody to kind of paint this as, typical prima donna recruit who's, trying to get a lot of attention and trying to play a look at me game. I think Gilbert has been really, frankly, throughout all of this, fairly content not to have people look at him, even though people like me that do this for a living are obviously very curious about what he's doing. Chris Walshcott says he's a young man and I hope it works out for him. And Chris, I'm glad to see you say that, because for me, this is one of the really important things, which is that, look, I've got a favorite team. Y'all have got favorite teams. We kind of get in here, and for years on this page, we've done this, kind of go back and forth with each other. But ultimately, this is a young man who gets one shot to do this. Whether we would choose my favorite school or choose your favorite school, whatever else, I am glad to see that we can say, hey, for him, I hope he likes where he ends up. I hope he feels at home there. I hope he feels comfortable there. I hope he has an experience there over the course of 3 or 4 years that sets him up for future success in life. I do think that's really important. I think that's really important. So I'm glad to see you say that. And I can honestly join you in saying, man, no matter which school that he chooses, I hope he's happy with the ultimate choice that he's able to make. And Cliff Nelson says the same thing, whatever's best for him and his family. And by the way, that's Cliff, an LSU fan, saying that. So that's I think very well said, and a tremendous sentiment to see expressed. Penn Jones says his mom did want him to stay at LSU, and yeah, I guess I'm not closed off the possibility that could reemerge as a factor here too. I mean, I think that we know so little related to all of that. I don't think you can exclude much of it. Now, you say, well, what are the most likely landing spots? I'm not quite so sure there is a next most likely landing spot. I think, anything from his previous recruitment provides a clue here. Anything in relationship to what has previously been stated by Gilbert and those within his camp, I think is a potential clue here. But yeah, I would include rejoining the LSU roster as a possibility. Because I don't have really any reason to exclude that as a possibility. I will say that I did not love the way that some former LSU players kind of took him to task when the what was described as an opt-out first occurred. Some former LSU players kind of jumped on Gilbert because Ed Orgeron had said his body was tired. He needed a break from football. And some former LSU players, kind of used that as a reason to criticize Gilbert. I didn't love that because, in my mind, that was former players holding something that not Gilbert had said, but Ed Orgeron had said. They were using that to hold that against Gilbert. So I didn't love that behavior. I don't know that Gilbert even noticed it, but I wasn't too happy about that. The way that some former LSU players were pretty critical of him when what was initially described as an opt-out took place. But we'll see. Tommy Howard says with the way that he's flip-flopping, he's going to end up being a cancer anywhere that he goes. I'm not quite so sure about that. I mean, I think some people want to kind of come down hard on him. All he's done is changed his mind. Listen, plenty of coaches have changed their mind before. I mean, heck, how did Alabama end up with Nick Saban? Because Rich Rodriguez changed his mind. And maybe people at the time said when Rich Rod decided to stick at West Virginia, not go to Alabama, that maybe he was, flip-flopping and being a prima donna or whatever else. But sometimes you just realize, hey, this is not the right move for me, and let me stop myself before I make a decision that I really, really regret. Sometimes that's, kind of what you do. And so in Gilbert's case here, no matter what school he chooses after this, I don't necessarily fault him for necessarily changing his mind. David Austin says, I hope he goes to Texas A&M. That's a new school to hear from. Cliff says, when you don't know the story, it's best not to comment. And I think that's true. Look, I think it's really easy to kind of know part of the information related to these really big name recruits, and therefore want to use stories we maybe remember from recent years and kind of fill in the gaps. Oh, I can remember when, this recruit did this thing I didn't like, and this guy must be like that guy. But in most of these instances, I think these situations can be fairly unique. Let me go back over to YouTube here for a moment and see what's going on over there, and we'll get ready to wrap up here in just a little bit. Yeah, so a lot of folks checking in on the YouTube side of things, and it's good to have all you watching over there on the Facebook side of things here too. Yeah, Gary Patman says he's not a prima donna. He's just got to figure it out. It's a big decision. I think that's right. I think that is right. Harold Morgan weighing in on the idea of the Rebels, saying Ole Miss got a great passing offense, might be a fit over there. And obviously Lane Kiffin's doing some big things around the SEC right now, and certainly utilized that passing attack pretty well. There's also been a fairly recent track record of successful tight ends coming out of the Ole Miss program too. So that's kind of an interesting idea. Not quite so far away from Baton Rouge, Louisiana, either, from the school where he's currently located. Daniel Lewis checking in to give us a go, Dogs. Appreciate that. We're going to bounce out of here right now. Thanks for being here. So, yeah, a lot of fun to do this. We wanted to kind of hop on here today because it's kind of a fun SEC piece of news. Who knows? But maybe we'll get a chance to do some of this more again really soon. We appreciate you joining it. We appreciate you being a part of it on both Facebook and YouTube. Y'all have a great rest of your weekend. To kind of wrap it all up here, Arik Gilbert has made his decision, or at least he's changed his mind on his previous decision. He's not going to Florida. We'll tune in to find out where he goes next. And hopefully here on these SEC country pages, I'll get a chance to talk